A little while back, a young man came to speak to me, asking for an opportunity to preach the sermon in one of our upcoming services. He was so full of enthusiasm and so full of energy that young people seem to generate just by being, and he was so keen to learn. And he asked me for some tips and some techniques on how best to prepare and to preach a sermon. And so I sat down at my computer with a blank page in front of me, and as I typed away, I realized a few things. I realized that I have been preaching for longer than this young man has been alive, and that over the 20 or so years that I've been preaching, I've picked up some knowledge along the way, things that work and things that don't work. And 20 years of experience can teach you some things. But what I actually realized is that much of what I do and why I do it is very unthought through. And while there is something beautiful about something that you've done consistently becoming intuitive over time, it doesn't leave a lot of space for growth or for intentionality. And so I realized that aside from the one course that I did when I first signed up for local preaching over 23 years ago, I haven't applied my mind to the craft much at all. Experience is a great teacher, yes, but it is not the only teacher. And we don't necessarily just automatically learn from our experiences. We learn from reflecting on our experiences. How much more could I have grown as a preacher if I had taken the time to read and to learn and to reflect on something that I have been doing every week for at least 20 years? I felt convicted, but in a good way, because it's never too late to learn. And so I brushed the dust off my old copy of W.E. Sangster's The Craft of the Sermon, and I was reminded again of the incredible privilege of the call to preach. Sangster says this, listen, he says, "What an incredible privilege to be allowed and equipped by God to do such lovely work. When one thinks of the awful wounds that life administers, to be able to speak a sure word of God to suffering souls is an honor of which no one is truly worthy." When was it that you first became aware of your own call to preach? It's often difficult to find the language to explain the fire that takes hold of us, but at some stage we all must. Certainly my tradition within the Methodist Church says that before anyone can begin the journey of being a local preacher, we all have to tell the story of our call. What's yours? If you have never told or articulated it, won't you take some time to write it down or to reflect on it or to share it with somebody? Because the call to preach really is where it all begins and ends, and the call to preach is what sustains us in the difficult middle. Different from a speech or a lecture or a motivational talk, preparing a sermon, preaching a sermon, is an act of obedience that points those who are listening to God. While a speech or a lecture can quite happily be your thoughts on a particular topic, preaching a sermon is God's work in the world. One is the gospel according to the speaker, and the other is the good news of Jesus Christ. In a speech, you might aim to win the listeners over to you, but in a sermon, your aim is to point people to Jesus, to decrease so that Jesus may increase, to make space for God to work in hearts and lives. Preaching a sermon is just not about the preacher, but it does involve the preacher giving the best hours of their week to prayerful work, so when the time to preach comes, we're ready. And the call is important because sometimes preaching is hard. We talk at home about the tyranny of the sermon and the wrestle of the preparation. But as a wise friend once said to me, the day you stop wrestling with your sermon is the day you hang up your preaching boots. And the reasons why may vary, but there will be days, there may even be entire seasons when the weight of preaching feels too much. Maybe you've run out of words. Maybe the stuff going on in your own life feels overwhelming. Maybe it's the dark night of the soul, or maybe you just don't want to. That's the time to remember that the work is God's, and that this call to this work is what sustains us, not any capacity of our own, and that preaching very often is just an act of obedience to a call, and that the God who calls us is faithful. So where does your story begin? And how's it going? Sangster in his book goes on to say, he says, it would be foolish, or worse, to suppose that because this work is divine in its origin, that there is no technique to study or craft to learn. The history of preaching records no sadder story than of those misguided zealots who have brought no consecration of mind to the preaching of the word. So I'm sure you know the parable of the pearl and the treasure, the story from Matthew 13, about the man who found treasure hidden in a field and in his joy sold everything he had to buy that field. And in finding a pearl of great value, gave everything away to acquire that pearl. Perhaps preaching is for us the treasure and the pearl. It asks a lot of us, everything, in fact. But only in giving everything away do we discover the joy in the finding, the great treasure that is this call to preach. So I found myself both convicted and inspired to continue to read, to listen to podcasts, to chat with other preachers about this craft and this calling. And this teaching series is a part of my own journey, my journey to grow and to learn in my craft as a preacher while sharing what I've learned along the way with others who are also on the road.